1 year ago, to the day, the people of Calcun Peak witnessed a horror from which we were certain we would not survive. So many innocent souls fell to that grotesque monster, the Gobbleman himself, set loose upon the world by my virgin blood. Yes, this was not by my hands. I did not offer it up willingly, or with any intention of unleashing the beast of legend. But the one who did inadvertently inspire such destruction and pain didn't live for long enough to witness the true nightmare he allowed to run rampant through this small town. I hoped that it was over, that we had succeeded in sealing away the demonic offspring of Nora Van Jansen for good. I think, somewhere in the back of my still tormented mind, I knew we hadn't seen the last of it. Whether it was its bloodlust, rage, or desire to seek vengeance that allowed it to spring loose once more, I can't say. I don't imagine the psyche of such a thing is exactly relatable after all. But the second those hollow, empty, and haunting eyes of the illuminated skull in the sky glared down on me for a second time, I just knew I wouldn't last until morning. Not this time. It was almost 2 months after the events which still torment my dreams when I received a phone call that turned my knees to gelatin again, not from that near paralyzing fear, but the almost perplexing shock of the information my mind could barely fathom. Dan was alive. The only living friend I had left by the time we sealed away that beaked monstrosity. The one whose blood reignited the magic that imprisoned it the first time. The one I knew could not have survived the brutal wounds inflicted by the beast, inadvertently sealing its own fate. The nurse who called me, Amalia, as she told me to call her, who had worked for the hospital out on Bear Island for some 40 years, providing me with completely unnecessary information as far as I was concerned at the time, said that my friend had been brought to their door the morning after that ill-fated Thanksgiving. Somehow he had washed up on the shore of the small town, which is generally only accessible by boat or across the bridge on the outskirts of Calcun Peak, only barely alive. With how much this news left my mind reeling, I pressed her for any more details she could provide on how this happened and the condition he was in, as she recommended that I wait to hear it from the man himself. Brooke Handy, who had become a significant part of my life ever since those early days of rebuilding the town left in ruins by the Gobbleman's rage, ran to my side after my legs gave out from beneath me. Even after the nurse hung up, I was almost mesmerized by the phone I held, just glaring at the damn thing as if the receiver was staring back at me. Though my girlfriend hadn't known Dan in any capacity, outside a passing relationship in high school, she could barely believe the news herself. Having listened to the many tales of my fallen friends, she felt as though she already knew them far more intimately than if they'd actually conversed more in life. Sure, she laughed about Lucas's hopeless crush on her, something she was both well aware of and never had any interest in pursuing. But we have shared many laughs and a good deal of tears over the past year, reflecting on those we lost that Thanksgiving. At this point, of course, with our relationship not even a couple of months along, we were still learning about each other, as much as those no longer with us. Even with that, she seemed as overjoyed as I was about reconnecting with a friend I was certain I'd never see again, once the initial shock settled down anyway. Within the hour, we were packed up with everything we may need for spending the following days on Bear Island and headed toward the outskirts of town. Brooke called ahead to arrange a hotel room, in which I would drop her off when we arrived. While I was eager to introduce Dan to my significant other, now that we were an official couple, she recommended that I may want to catch up with my old friend without any distractions. Though we had been almost inseparable for weeks by this point, I couldn't deny that she was likely right on this one. As we crossed over the bridge, I saw the large and ominous tree in the distance, an enormous, blackened behemoth towering over all of its forest siblings, which wore the inscription of the small island's moniker etched into its bark. According to the tales we learned back in school, the more family-friendly version of the birth of Calcon, this imposing tree was planted soon after more settlers arrived to take up residence on the island. I can't deny that I found the jagged words, simply reading Bear Island, carved into the massive trunk a little unsettling. I can't say why, but over the handful of times my uncle and I had visited this place in my youth, that tree inspired less than pleasant goosebumps to line my flesh, a sensation that my skin repeated upon entering the city limits. Though not as haunting as the myth of the Gobbleman wiping out the settlers of my old stomping ground, a legend I now knew to be true, Bear Island had its own unnerving history. While it was much more recent than the fall of the settlement of Calcon, the event which left this place in ruins had happened only 50 years or so before our tires bounced from the bridge to the road. The thing about this particular event, though, is that no one seems to know what really happened, which seems a bit strange to me, being only 5 decades ago. Some theorize that it was some sort of dispute between the townfolk that led to the entire village being burned to the ground. Others have spun more fantastical tales of the gateway between this world and the other beneath, breaking wide open to allow the beast from below to reduce it to charred rubble in a matter of hours. To be honest, I tend to think that it's one of those things that has been blown out of proportion, given the more brutal story that left their neighboring city a ghost town many, many moons ago. I don't know, maybe they were a bit jealous of the far more creative tale that left Calcon in ruins, carving out their own history of terror. Now, whatever the case, I always found something mysterious and haunting about this place. Growing up with such bizarre mythology and a belief system since birth will do that to a kid, I suppose. Make them prone to buying into whatever batshit crazy lore the old folks feel like spinning. Still, having endured the darker side of legend firsthand, I wasn't about to let my guard down, whether I bought into this one or not. For the time being, though, my only focus was on my friend, and finding out how he survived our last encounter. A few miles after falling somewhat silent, the inherent heebie-jeebies of that old tree having subsided, I suggested that perhaps Brooke should drop me off at the hospital, rather than me leaving her at the hotel room alone. Even with it being her idea for me to head on without her, I still felt like an asshole about ditching her with no transportation. With that, when we pulled up in front of the hospital, just a ways beyond the last buildings in town, my girlfriend assured me that she would return in an hour or two. It was strange that I felt so nervous about this. Dan and I had been tight for years, but my heart was racing while I tapped my foot on the elevator floor. Perhaps I was simply worried about seeing him like this, potentially hooked up to machines or with stitches and bandages holding his broken body together. Maybe it just felt strange to not have my girlfriend by my side, as we had grown to rely on each other so much over the previous months. Whatever it was, my reluctance and apprehension completely faded away the second I walked into Dan's third-floor room to see him sitting upright, flipping me off. Yes, there were crimson stains leaking from the bandages wrapped around his midsection, but otherwise he looked healthier than I think I'd ever seen him, with a wide grin plastered across his almost unrecognizably sober face. It wasn't until I approached his bedside, resisting the urge to hug the crazy bastard, when he gave me a very distinct "don't fucking touch me" look, when I noticed the far more familiar droop to his eyes. Though it wasn't alcohol coursing through his system, the first words he spoke to me were almost bragging about the wicked awesome drugs they had him on to dull the pain of his injuries. After some awkward chuckles on my behalf, choosing not to get into his sermon on the delightful nature of his painkillers, we just caught up for a while. He winced a few times while we ventured across topics from past events with our fallen friends to how my life had changed since that horrendous Thanksgiving. Once we settled down from anything particularly grueling or emotional, though, my friend finally got to what I really wanted to know. what he could remember about the night we sealed away the Gobbleman, and how he found himself many miles away from that now reinforced wall. As he told it, the second that beak burst through his gut, he just knew he was finished. The monster started flipping out when that bright light began to consume them while I leapt out of the cave. Apparently, the creature attempted to reach out for me, slipping his hands and feet on the blood spewing from Dan, but he wrapped his arms around him, holding on with every bit of strength he had left. He could barely register the squeal the beast let out over the ground rumbling and that high-pitched howl caused by the light itself, but he just hoped he could hold the monster down for long enough. As that noise grew louder, he felt the rocks wrapping around him, like he was becoming part of the wall itself. He just knew it was over, and that his journey had come to an end. Between that and him trying to hold that bastard down while keeping his guts from spilling out, he was screaming and howling as well, with his eyes closed tight, refusing to even register the pain while preparing for the end. When his eyes blinked back open, though he couldn't even imagine how it happened, he was bobbing around in the water. Unsure if he had somehow been blasted from the cavern like a cannon, or maybe some Indiana Jones-inspired tunnel sent him sliding down through the mountain and out into the lake, he honestly didn't care. The only thing that mattered to him at that moment was keeping his insides from escaping while battling to stay afloat. He began to panic, freaking out and screaming again, but before he knew it, he felt the ground beneath his feet. Opening his eyes again to see the riverbank ahead, he hobbled onward, collapsing and passing out when he finally got to fully dry land. When he finally awakened, he was right here in this room, with bandages around his gut. When he was still somewhat out of it, the doctor informed him of the hours of surgery, and that it was almost miraculous that he wasn't worse off. That beak didn't even graze his spine, though it did obliterate one of his kidneys. With around 70 stitches in his gut and another 40 or so in his back, they informed him that he should be moving around soon enough. What he found especially strange, though, was that it was a good 2 weeks after that Thanksgiving when he woke up here, and had only been unconscious for a few days. Now, he was still quite mentally vacant at this point. By the time Dan's story came to a close, after a brief moment of silent consideration between the two of us, Brooke casually poked her head around the open door frame. Yeah, there was a bit of an awkward back and forth, while my old friend giggled like a kindergartner, discovering a buddy's hopeless crush, as we both knew how Lucas felt about her. But that passed quickly, giving way to more relaxed conversation. Well, relaxed for a very blitzed Dan, anyway. After another hour or so, my girlfriend and I bid our goodbyes, with the promise to return the following day. And my stoned friend seemed a bit saddened by our departure, as he had not had the first visitor since reawakening here, but he had only become more clear-headed and verbal over the previous couple of days, as the nurse told it, so they hadn't placed many phone calls yet. Yeah, sure, they had called his old man, who apparently sounded less than concerned by the fact that his son had survived that Thanksgiving, which he had slept through, passed out on the couch, completely oblivious to the destruction until the following morning. I always knew his father was a deadbeat drunk, something I feared may be in his own future if he didn't make some adjustments, but I never realized he was that fucked up, that he would seem so indifferent to something like this. Over the following days, we continued to visit Dan. His regular nurse informed me that she hadn't seen his spirits so high since the night he was brought in here. As she told it, she had been by his side through every step of his recovery, even talking by his bedside as he would fall asleep each night. She was positively beaming from seeing his mood having improved significantly with every time we showed up there. After another few weeks passed by, with Brooke and I visiting regularly, after returning back home, my friend was ready to be released from the hospital. Yeah, he still had a decent amount of physical therapy to endure, which would be arranged at the hospital back in Calcon Peak, but things were looking up for him. Given that his father was still showing absolutely no interest in the condition of his son, I offered to put him up at my place for a while, after running that by Brooke, of course. I still lived in Tony's house, having been left the deed upon his passing. It's a decent-sized house in which my girlfriend has practically moved in herself, but my old bedroom was on the first floor, and we were just a few miles from the hospital, so I figured that would fit the bill for my old friend. Once he was officially released from the hospital, the nurse still grinning like a 5-year-old birthday girl as she watched her patient walk to the car on somewhat trembling and weakened legs, we hit the road back home. Everything was going smoothly while we crossed the miles in pursuit of the bridge back to town. That was until we caught sight of that ancient, imposing tree off in the distance ahead. We had all been cutting up and laughing, with Dan wincing from time to time, his mangled gut still not fully accustomed to his chuckles yet, only inspiring his high-as-balls ass to laugh even harder. But as we drew closer to the city limits, his laughter just stopped, giving way to whimpering pleas to pull over. I thought he was just fucking around at first, until we were almost right at the edge of town. But when he practically screamed out for me to slam on the brakes, I almost jerked the wheel right into the damn tree from the shock and volume and pitch of his wails. The second my tires screeched to a halt, he threw open the back door, stumbling to the breakdown lane. I flipped on my hazard lights, jumping right out after him, terrified he was going to rip open the wound, which had only recently had the stitches removed. It was as if he didn't even hear me when I ran to his side, wrapping my arm around him to keep his jelly legs from sending him back to the ground, begging him to tell me what the hell was going on. As we approached the massive tree, my eyes meeting the side of it upon which they had never looked before, Dan began to mutter under his breath words I could not even hope to make out. He seemed to be in some sort of trance, lowering to his knees to brush the dried leaves from the large stone slab embedded into the ground at the base of the thick trunk. Between his palms spread across the faded inscription on the stone monolith and the decay having rendered the rock cracked and smoothed out, I could make a single word of what had been once carved into it. All I could think to do was to shout my friend's name, hoping that I could break him out of whatever the hell was going on with him. Finally, laying my hand on his shoulder and lowering my voice to a more compassionate and understanding tone, though I wasn't feeling exactly understanding at the time, he jerked his head to the side, his muttering falling short. He just glared up at me, a confused expression replacing the more frantically determined one, asking me what the hell was going on. I just shrugged, having no words to offer on the subject. Moments later, I helped him to his feet before Brooke and I led him back to the car. He was still a bit out of it over the next few miles, as was I, truth be told. Between the tree still having that unsettling effect on me, and my friend being, entranced by the damn thing, I had no idea what to think. I could tell that the experience had shaken my girlfriend as well, but we all began to settle down the further we got from Bear Island. As strange as it sounds, I didn't realize how off my body had felt until we secured ourselves back in my hometown. Like that place discombobulated my whole being, if that makes the slightest bit of sense. Within a few days, things got back to normal, or whatever qualifies for normal in Calcon Peak. Weeks turned to months, with Dan getting both used to the somewhat smaller population in town, as well as his weekly routines and hospital visits. By the time another few months had passed, my old friend was back to himself. I would still find him distancing himself a bit at times, as he was still haunted by the events which led him closer to death's door than I had been. Honestly, I can't even imagine what was going on in his head with everything he endured that night and over the weeks that followed. Still, between his recovery and having picked up a job at a local garage, Dan was probably in the best physical shape of his life, even with those lingering demons. He still lived at my place, but was now picking up some of the bills, making life so much easier for Brooke and I. It wasn't until time brought us to that November, following the events which still haunted everyone in this town, when Dan's mental state took a turn for the worse. Yeah, just about everyone around here had tensed up by the time October came to a close, but I could tell that there was something far more significant going on with my roommate. Both Brooke and I attempted to talk to him, while assuring him that we were there for him, but he would rarely leave his bedroom when he wasn't at work. I started noticing an increase in the beer cans and bottles in the trash, though I couldn't blame him for revisiting the habit he never quite fully let go of, with this particular anniversary coming up. My girlfriend and I mutually decided to give him some space, while keeping our eyes on him. I didn't want to inadvertently push him away, or pester him to the point of annoyance, but I was worried about the guy. He wasn't himself, well, any version of the old and newer self he had been throughout our friendship. When that Thanksgiving Day arrived, however, there was nothing I could do to convince him to step 1 foot from the comfort of his bedroom. And while no one in Calcon Peak felt inspired to actually celebrate the season anymore, we invited a few friends over, and not for the sake of the holiday, of course. I think, to a certain degree, we felt a bit more safe in numbers, whether content in the knowledge that the beaked monstrosity was safely sealed away or not. We had chosen, as a group, to remain inside until the holiday came and went, having stocked up on food and drinks to make things as comfortable as possible. Even with friends there, Dan had not even moved that day, and not that I could tell anyway. He just stayed locked up in his room, but I didn't even hear him shifting around in there the entire day. Not until around 6 o'clock. Dwayne and Alice, with whom I had a passing relationship in high school, were a brother and sister who Brooke had known since junior high. They were both amongst the more popular crowd back in the day, but had grown far more timid, yet matured since surviving that horrific Thanksgiving. Alice's boyfriend, James, had come along as well. I can't say I was particularly fond of him. He's one of those guys who always had a story to top whatever anyone else said, and could be far too cocky for his own good. Honestly, it reminded me a lot of Brett, which was not necessarily a good thing. Alice was a pretty girl, but quite soft-spoken and quiet. She and James seemed an odd fit, and I couldn't help but think she wasn't fully invested in their relationship. But what the hell do I know about such things? I had absolutely no experience with the opposite sex until Brooke, and was still learning more about this incredible emotion with each passing day. Dwayne is one of those guys who has a joke for everything, often inspiring his sister's eyes to roll in the process. I'd actually grown quite fond of that guy though, even if his desperate need to make everyone laugh could get old at times. To be honest, as much as I did enjoy sharing the company of this new group of friends, aside from James, I wouldn't allow myself to get too close with any of them. Granted, I've always been a bit of an introvert, rarely feeling at ease with even those I had grown up alongside. But, I don't know. Having lost so many I cared about, I suppose I was reluctant to get too involved. Brooke was a special case, of course. I don't think I had ever felt as connected with anyone as I do with her. Dan and I had become as close as siblings since he rejoined the living, but there was still an almost impenetrable distance between us. Like there was something he was hiding from me that I couldn't quite break through. That night, though, I couldn't convince him to as much as show himself. The rest of us were just sitting around the living room, watching a movie and attempting to distance our minds from the holiday. There had been some casual discussions here and there, but the closer it came to sundown, a somber silence encompassed the room. It wasn't until we heard the creaking floorboards, followed by the door being unlocked and opened, that we all just sprung back to awareness. Brooke and I were the first to react, both of us practically leaping to our feet, sprinting down the short hallway to find the front door wide open and the taillights of Dan's car gunning it down the road. Without a word, we threw on our shoes, while I whipped up the car keys. The rest of the group piled into the back seat, no one speaking the first word as I cranked the engine. Though there was no trace of Dan's car by the time we pulled out of the driveway, I had the strangest feeling that I knew exactly where he was headed. Sure, we hadn't even thought about visiting Bear Island since the morning we left the hospital behind, almost 9 months before. But that's where he was going. I had no doubt about it. Given the lack of any other vehicle on the road, the entire city looking like a ghost town with no one celebrating the annual holiday, I felt no hesitation in pushing the pedal to the floor. Even with that, I couldn't see a hint of Dan's taillights, certain that he would be abusing the speed limit himself. The world before us was heavily muted behind a dense fog, making things feel all the more eerie and unsettling. Regardless of the scenery before me being far more hidden than usual, I had reached a point in which I could likely drive these roads blindfolded, but that small comfort did nothing for the growing pit in my stomach. When my tires bounced onto the bridge, I could see the ambient red glow ahead, on the other side, right beside the silhouetted tree, inspiring those same old goosebumps, but far more violently than ever before. The closer we drew to the official entrance to Bear Island, though, I noticed the position of my friend's vehicle, sideways, blocking the entire road ahead. Screeching my tires to a halt, before inadvertently slamming into Dan's Chevy, I felt my heart attempting to leap into my throat, a condition that was all the more hastened when I noticed the shadowed form knelt down behind the tree. While he was mostly hidden from my view, the position of his parked car keeping me trapped behind the city limits, the almost eerie beam of his taillights revealed enough to know that he had returned to that stone tablet embedded into the earth. With that, I wasted no time in throwing open my door, hopping over his trunk like fucking Starsky and/or Hutch, praying that I could close the gap between us before it was too late. I can't say what it was that made me so certain of what he was planning, nor the fact that the mind guiding his actions was not fully under his control at the time, but somehow, regardless of the many miles between the entrance to Bear Island and the sealed-shut cavern high upon that mountain we left behind, I knew what was going on here. By the time I full-on tackled my friend, with Brooke and the others still approaching where we both tumbled to the grass and dirt, the ground trembling beneath where we lay assured me that I was too late. Dan, apparently still attempting to gather his bearings, just gazed up at me, puzzled by my attack as much as our location. As we both glared down at the dripping wound he had carved into his palm and the crimson streak across that carved rock at the base of the tree, I looked from his horror-stricken eyes to those of my girlfriend. "What have you done?" I asked as a subtle glow cast my shadow across the dried leaves. Dan just stared back at me, his body visibly trembling and his wide eyes leaking, shaking his head from one side to the other. When that all too familiar, haunting gobbling began to echo from where the bark now split alongside us, that soft illumination down its center evolving into a vibrant and almost blinding light, I lifted myself to my shivering legs. I knew what was coming, what would be rampaging through the small island any second now. As I helped Dan back to his feet, averting my gaze back to my girlfriend again, before darting my eyes between my car and the one that led us here, my mind was made up before I even realized it. "Go," I said to Brooke, nodding my head in the direction of the town we left behind. She bargained with me that all of us should speed back across that bridge, but I wouldn't hear it. I had to warn the residents of Bear Island of what was coming for them, but I would not endanger the life of the woman I still loved more with every new day. I knew what that monster was capable of, but Dan and I had defeated it once. Yes, I was pissed at him for what he'd done, whether he was in control of his actions or not, but it was my blood that unleashed it the last time. I still couldn't fully fathom to what drove him to this, nor how a fucking tree could release that monster back into the world from the cavern within which we had sealed it. But none of that mattered. "Please," I begged, Brooke's eyes spilling a river down her face. "I need to know that you're safe. Please, just..." There were whispered discussions going on between the other members of our small group, but my attention was solely focused on those big brown eyes within which I could so easily drown. Dwayne slapped me across the arm, insisting that he was coming along too, but Alice had already headed back to my car, with far less bargaining from her boyfriend, while I refused to look away from Brooke. As she pressed her lips to mine, cupping the side of my face with her palms, I would not allow the aching in my chest to shutter my determination. Dried leaves poured from the surrounding trees, with the trembling ground growing all the more violent, but I had to know that she would do as I asked before I could get moving. Reluctantly turning back to my vehicle, my girlfriend looked back one last time before climbing in, backing up, and heading across the bridge. With that, Dwayne, James, Dan, and I sprinted for his car, silently agreeing on me taking the driver's seat. As I hastily corrected the alignment of the wheels to make our way into the likely damn town ahead, that wailing gobble grew so loud that I could swear it would split the fabric of reality in two. I felt every single drop of the blood speeding through my veins, dropping to the tip of my toes as the glow from above shifted in the most hauntingly familiar way. Dan just glared at me from the passenger seat, slipping a bottle from his glove compartment, draining its contents down his gullet, before we both hesitantly glanced upward. I swear I could feel those hollowed-out eyes of the illuminated skull in the sky, gazing back into mine, mocking me as though I had the nerve to believe we would never meet again. "Oh God," Dwayne whimpered as we watched in horror when that slender beak began to protrude from the widening split in the rough bark. I wouldn't look back, my determination not faltering as I pushed the pedal to the floor, squealing the tires as we sped from that massive tree of the damned. I had to reach town before that monster made it there, and find a way to send it back to hell for a second time. There was no way to know if I would survive this time. I had no doubt that it would remember both Dan and I, should it make contact with those beady, blackened eyes. But I had no time to dwell on that. Death was coming for the residents of Bear Island, and I, for one, was not about to give it what it wanted, not without a fight. Whether I lived to see the end of this Thanksgiving or not, I would make sure that the Gobbleman would not see morning.
It'd been just another pleasant Thanksgiving here on Bear Island. This ain't a big town or nothing, but we'd always get a nice spread of good folks right outside the office in the town square. It wasn't nothing fancy, just more of a gathering than any sort of parade, but I always did look forward to it. Only a few of my fellow officers of the law had come in today, not that we really needed them. Hell, I just let them head out and enjoy the festivities, while I held things down at the station. Ain't no sense in all four of us lingering. It's not like anything exciting ever happens around these parts. Yeah, we heard all about the shenanigans that supposedly happened on the other side of the bridge last year. I reckon them stories were packed with just as much shit as the old folklore, if I'm being honest. I'd only moved out to this side of the country some 10 years back, but hadn't never seen nothing more alarming than some vehicular collisions. I was just kicking back in my chair watching the TV while everyone else was enjoying themselves outside when the ground began to rumble a bit. I strolled out to see folks darting their eyes round, looking a bit rattled at first, but when things calmed back down, folks got back to socializing. Yeah, it ain't often we get any quakes out here, but ain't nothing to get worked up about. Some 10 minutes later, when those damn kids run in, damn near bursting down my front door, talking 50 miles an hour about evacuating the city, I just knowed they was pulling some kind of prank. Hell, one of them even looked like he was about shit-faced, and the other three was talking over each other, making not the first bit of sense. The skinny kid in front, the one with the shaggy hair, told the rest of them to head back outside and try to clear folks out of the square, while I was just watching them, trying to figure out exactly what they've been smoking. Whoa now, I told them, catching their attention before they run on out, breaking up everyone else's phone with their silliness. You leave those good folks alone. Whatever beef you got, don't concern them. I knowed they wasn't from around these parts. Just about everyone knows everyone in this little town, so I had to believe that this was some dare gone wrong or something. Whatever they was on, though, I wasn't about to let him stick a fork in the celebration of the season. Yeah, these four were more likely from the other side of the bridge, trying to ruin Thanksgiving for this town, just like it's been tainted on their side of the lake. I was halfway tempted to toss them all in the tank, just let them sleep it off until morning come, but I could barely get a word in after I stopped them from running back out, let alone slap shackles on them. Between the earthquake that rattled the town some minutes before they showed up, the frantic state they was in, and the few belts of my flask I'd knocked back over the last few hours of fighting off sleep, I just wasn't in the mood. I just yelled out at the top of my lungs until they shut their damn mouths for 2 fucking seconds. All 4 of them damn near jumped out of their skin when I hollered out, which brought me a bit of a smile, if I'm being honest.
Please,
the skinny kid said, looking downright pitiful.
You have to listen. It's coming. You have to...
What's coming? I cut in with a sigh, having a feeling this was about to get even more absurd.
Just look outside. Look at the moon.
Even with that pitiful look on his face being transformed to something far more confident, I didn't want to play his stupid game. That was until I heard the screams and gasps from outside, along with the commotion of folks running and cars cranking up. With another sigh, I strolled out from behind the counter, prepared to have all them little shits laughing in my face when I turned back to face them. The closer I got to the door, though, my eyes catching sight of the townfolk panicking, while some just stood in place, staring at the sky. I can't lie, I damn near upchucked every swig of the whiskey I'd knocked back when I saw that shivering skull looking down on me as I walked out onto the pavement. That wasn't the only thing that made my heart skip, though. Off in the distance, carried by the wind that comes from the other side of town, I heard a sound that churned my guts something awful. A sound I'd only heard about in stories I never believed. The teens was yelling at me while I stood there like a statue, glaring up at that haunting vision in the sky, but it was just a muffled moan to my bewildered ears. I knowed that goblin sound was coming closer, but I couldn't make my body move. There were more frantic voices as folks come running out their front doors, joining the crowd in the square, each of them letting out yelps and whines. Somewhere beyond my horror-struck brain, I figured they was likely as tore up as I was about what was looking down on us, but I still couldn't even make my paralyzed legs work. The boys what run into the station finally snapped me back to the here and now when one of them slapped me across the face. On any normal day, I would have tossed their ass into a cell without batting an eye for something like that. But this here was no normal day.
Everyone get to your cars and get the hell out of town!
Tall of the teens yelled out, shoving folks to get their attention while his friends was doing the same. One of the boys looked to be more staggering than running from one person to the next, so I figured he was as plumb scared as I was. I took to shaking as much sense into folks as I could, just like they was doing. But I don't think it made a bit of difference by the time I heard the branches snapping from the trees next to the road out of town. Jesus Christ, someone hollered, along with a variety of other shocked yelps when it landed on the ground some 20 yards or so from where I stood, freezing in my tracks again. Even though I'd heard the tales just like I suppose anyone around these parts and across the bridge had, I could have never prepared myself for what I looked at, my jaw hanging loose. Even though it was a ways off, I just knowed it had to be standing a good 7 feet tall, all hunched and feral. The light of the skull moon reflected off that long and pointed beak, instantly giving me a vision of it piercing through my chest and out my back. The way it slowly wiggled them long and clawed fingers when it began to casually walk towards me, I just knowed I was fucked. Between the transfixed stare of those impossibly dark eyes, the confident yet god-awful hungry steps it took, one by one, edging closer by the second, and the way that beak almost looked to be smiling, I knowed I didn't stand a chance. All I could do as I drawed my gun from my holster was hope that I could make way for others to escape, that I could save as many of these poor bastards as I could. "Run! Get to your cars and go!" I yelled, keeping as much control of my pistol as I could, squeezing off that first round. I couldn't tell what was going on around me, whether folks was doing as I told them or were still as frozen as I'd been, but I couldn't let that distract me. I had full tunnel vision, zeroed in on that monster with every bullet I sent its way, not as much as slowing it down. I heard more engines rumbling to life, tires screeching, and more panicked townsfolk howling. But my place was right here. Hell, I reckoned I couldn't break free if I wanted to by this point, and boy did I want to. Didn't matter though. I was gonna do my duty until the end of the road, whether it was when my heart give out naturally or a goddamn beak covered in my guts. When my gun was spent, my fingers still pitifully clicking the trigger, I just threw the damn thing at the feathered fuck, what was only a few feet from me, glaring down on me as I fell to the ground. I wanted to close my eyes, but they was burning from the tears trickling down. I couldn't look away, no matter how much I begged them to shut. That monster let out a satisfied wobble as it stood right before me. I was done for. I just knowed it. That's what I thought anyway, until I heard the volume ramping up on more tires spinning. I swear that thing looked all kind of dumbstruck, its eyes wide and its beak falling open over those seconds it caught sight of the grill gunning toward it. "Get in!" that same skinny teen yelled after he toppled that freak to the concrete, his buddy throwing open the back door. I stumbled to my feet as quick as I could, laughing like a madman flipping his lid. Once more, I was tunnel visioned on my goal, my shaky legs fighting against the tarmac. My heart was racing while my mind was going 70 miles above the speed limit. I thought I was safe, you know? Thought I could make it after all. But right as I reached out to that open door,
it all happened so fast my brain could barely catch up. I couldn't even believe how fast that fucking thing was. I was sure we had more time to clear out this damn town, or at least as many as we could convince to leave, but it didn't take long to see how full of shit I'd been thinking that way. It was moving so slowly as it freed itself from that tree, which sounds absolutely batshit now that I say it out loud, but I was certain we had more time. In all honesty, if I'd known this was gonna be a fucking suicide mission, I sure as shit wouldn't have come along. Hell, I was ready to head back home with Alice, but she told me I should go with Benny and the guys. I was out of town last Thanksgiving, and didn't hear about everything that went down until I got back home, but I figured a lot of the shit they said was exaggerated. Sure, the town was in rough shape, and supposedly half the residents were in graves when I rolled back in. You know how things get blown out of proportion, especially in small towns. I just wish I'd tried to understand how bad it was, you know? I wish I'd listened. I wish I hadn't come along with Benny and the guys. That's a damn fact. Yeah, I'm probably stronger than the three of them combined. But this whole mission felt dumber by the second. Brooke's boyfriend always seemed like a bit of a Weasley little pissant to me, and at the time, I didn't buy into a word of what she told me about him being the hero of Calcun Peak, so I couldn't believe he was about to risk his life or anything. I guess the wuss had more balls than I gave him credit for, all things considered. I still should have ignored Alice and just went with my gut, hauling ass away from this damn place with the girls. Yeah, she probably would have talked shit for some weeks, but she could get over it, as far as I was concerned. When we reached the police station, Benny didn't hesitate, just damn near leaping from his car, not even waiting for me and Dwayne, or Dan's plastered ass. By the time we ran in, okay, me and Dwayne ran, Dan stumbled. Semantics. The sheriff was already rolling his eyes at my butt. Didn't take him long to take things more seriously when he finally listened and looked up at the sky, though. That's when things got nuts. While we were busy attempting to shake some sense into the folks running around like a room full of toddlers on crack, screaming at the top of our lungs for them to move their asses, I almost pissed myself when the gunshots rang out. When Benny ran for his car while the sheriff was unloading on that freak, I almost thought he was bailing for a second. Dan staggered after him with Dwayne helping him along, and I wasn't about to be left alone, so I hauled ass to the car as well. I swear I thought we could save the sheriff when Benny plowed down that freak, but there was nothing we could do. I didn't even realize it had gotten back to his feet until the cop's blood gushed through the open door when that beak gouged into his head, gore and bone practically covering Dwayne, who had scooched over to sit bitch, trying to make room for the sheriff. It was like the skull was nothing more than a block of butter impaled by a steaming hot knife. But when it reared back, only to stab through again and again, Benny threw it into reverse and hit the gas. I tried not to look back as he spun himself around, but I couldn't stop myself. As we sped back away from that town square, back toward the road we took to get here, I watched that monster drop the sheriff to the ground, leaping onto his next victim, and some poor old lady who looked to be trying her damnedest to unlock her truck. I didn't know if crossing back across the bridge would be enough, or if we would even make it that far. It was the best shot we had. Other vehicles were speeding in every direction, some crashing into each other, and more bottlenecking the entry to the road. Benny was trying to weave around them as much as he could, but fear does some fucked up things to folks, unfortunately. Right as he bounced the tires over the curb to the right of where the pileup was forming, tearing into the grass on the side of the 2-lane road in an attempt to get around those blocking the path, something slammed into our side, sending us through the railing, tumbling down the steep drop-off. I hadn't spent much time on Bear Island, so I wasn't familiar enough with the place to know if it was just a short ravine or a full-on cliff we were rolling down. But I just knew we were fucked. On top of that, it happened so damn fast. Everything since watching that damn tree split itself open had been like a nightmarish blur. But I didn't know if it was another car or the Gobbleman itself that threw us off the road. It wasn't until we hit the bottom with another slam, leaving us on the roof, when I realized that I was still alive. I was so disoriented, I couldn't tell if we'd been tumbling for seconds or hours. All I could do was let out a shaky breath, hoping to God that we were safe, at least for the time being. Once the car got done rocking from side to side, I could make out those horrific sounds of destruction and death from back in that town square. There were more gunshots ringing out, but every one of them was silenced quickly. Every gargled scream and each squelch of blood splashing to the ground made me fight not to puke even harder than the last. Benny, Dan, and Dwayne were all still quiet, making me worry that I was the only one who had survived. I was scared to make a sound, making my best efforts to ignore the carnage coming from somewhere above us. I don't even know how long I lay there, crumpled on the ceiling of my buddy's car, praying that the monster would just move on after the howls of pain and crunching metal fell silent. I whispered the names of my friends, hoping they were still with me, and even nudged Dwayne a bit, who was practically laying on top of me. But they didn't respond. I just knew that they were gone, and that I was now alone in this damn town. Alone with that fucking beaked monstrosity. I had to get moving and make my way back to that bridge. The glass was shattered beside me, so I just rolled Dwayne off me and crawled through, still trying to keep every move as stealthy as possible. When I got out, I peered back in to see Benny and Dan slumped over with blood trickling down their faces, not moving a muscle. It was dark, even with the skull moon shining down on us, but I was sure they weren't breathing. The woods around me looked dense and even darker, so I had a decision to make. Climb back up to the road, or risk burying myself deeper into the forest. I never had the best sense of direction, plus things sounded quiet from above, from what I could tell, so I just went with my gut, reluctantly climbing back up that hill. It was steep enough, but not too bad. I was able to dig my hands into the dirt, getting enough of a grip to make decent progress. Plus, it seemed we'd only rolled a good 15 to 20 feet. Nothing I couldn't handle. Yeah, I was trembling something awful, shaken by what I witnessed before we tried to escape, as much as being left alone. But I couldn't just wait there. When I reached the top, I wouldn't let my eyes meet the scattered limbs and blood splattered across and still dripping onto the road, fighting my urge to hurl from what my periphery could make out. Honestly, looking back, I don't know if that or my decision to crawl out of the wreckage was my dumbest choice, but the moment that tapping sound met my ears, I knew it didn't matter. When I finally looked up, it was just standing there in the middle of the road with its arms crossed and that grotesque blood-soaked head cocked to one side, tapping its foot. I knew I didn't have a chance, but I sprung to my shivering legs, climbing over the pile of cars we tried to get around before we were knocked over the ledge. I kept cutting glances over my shoulder to see it still standing there, watching me trying to get away until it was hidden behind the wreckage to my back. Was it letting me go? Could it be taking pity on me, giving me a fighting chance? Nope. It was fucking with me like the gullible asshole I am. I thought I could make it, running down that empty road as fast as I could on my shaky legs. But when I heard the branches snapping overhead, with the leaves and twigs raining down on me, I felt even that small fragment of hope leaving my body, along with a fresh stream of piss I couldn't hold back. It just dropped down before me like a damn superhero, raising back up from the ground and rolling its hauntingly long neck. I fell to the concrete, my legs giving out, just like the sheriff's had, as that freak casually strolled toward me. I was sobbing like a fucking baby when it stopped right in front of me, glaring down with those hollow eyes. I looked at it. It looked at me. Everything was quiet while I mentally pleaded for another car to swoop in and save me, just like Benny had tried to save the sheriff. But nothing was coming. While it rolled its neck again, letting out a quivering moan, I just knew it was preparing to strike. But I wasn't about to go down like a bitch. Before I had a chance to give it a second guess, I whipped my pocket knife out, flipped it open, and jammed it into whatever kind of man turkey balls it has. It howled out so loud that it damn near made my ears bleed, so I just pulled back, jamming my tiny blade into its feathered dick over and over again, screaming out with every poke. When it fell to its knees, clutching its crotch, I took off running again. As it turns out, not only was that bastard one hell of a fast healer, but it would seem that the Gobbleman has a bit of a karmic justice side, much to my dismay. I didn't even know what hit me when it full-on tackled me from behind, slamming my face to the ground before it leapt up from the tarmac with one of my ankles held in each hand. When my head slammed back to the pavement, my legs spread in either direction, it howled out one last time. Before... When I came to, having flopped to the ceiling in the back of Dan's upside-down car, I honestly had no idea what the hell was going on. I was disoriented, freaked out, and in a fairly decent amount of pain. It wasn't until I literally peeled my head away from the vinyl lining that I realized I was bleeding. Patting the side of my face, moving my fingers upward in search of a wound, I couldn't seem to find where the blood was oozing from. That's when I remembered everything that happened back in the town square, how the sheriff's head had splattered across me. I fell to the ground as I tumbled through the open door, heaving across the leaves, my heart jackhammering from the fear of exposing myself. Gasping for breath and doing everything I could to remain quiet, after hurling the contents of my gut to the dried leaves, I came to two sudden realizations. The first was that the occupants of the driver's and passenger side seats looked to be long gone, unmoving and bloody. The second, after seeing the state of two of my friends, was that the third was nowhere to be found. It was around that time that I noticed the rustling sounds coming from somewhere above me. Hesitantly glancing upward, certain that I would meet the haunting gaze of that beaked monstrosity, I saw James having almost reached the top of the ravine we had tumbled down. Slapping my hand to my mouth, after instinctively beginning to call out for him, I made the quick decision not to follow the course he was taking. Not only was I incredibly apprehensive about returning to the center of town, given the state it was in the last time I saw it, but, and now I know this is not the most noble act, I figured if the monster was still in the vicinity up there, maybe James could distract it enough for me to slip by unnoticed. I snuck around Dan's wrecked car, moving into the woods as silently as I could, while attempting to keep track of the direction of the road above. Within moments, I could barely see a thing, the light of the skull moon barely carving through the dense forest. But when I heard the gut-churning scream from back toward that road, I just froze. As the echo of rushed footsteps joined that panicked howling, it wasn't hard to figure out what was happening. That James was trying to escape a bloody demise. Sure, I felt like a chicken shit asshole for not trying to catch up with my sister's boyfriend. What the hell could I have done had I followed his footsteps? In all honesty, I always thought that Alice was too good for James. He was a self-involved douche and a cocky prick to boot. Yeah, maybe I was focusing on what an asshole he was in hopes of making myself feel better about ditching his ass, but I knew that had I attempted to intervene in any way, that we'd both end up dead. By the time that terrified wail turned into a gargled, agony-stricken shriek, highlighted with the sound of gore spilling to the concrete, I was shivering so badly that I just knew I would be discovered any second. As it was, after I heard heavy feet plundering across the concrete, distancing all the more, I thought I may just survive this after all. I still stayed there, trembling like a kid scared of the monster in the closet, until a more distant, horrified wailing echoed across the island, assuring me that the monster had moved deeper into the town in search of new prey. Even with the echoes of mayhem assuring me that I may indeed be out of harm's way, I was reluctant to climb out of those woods. Being that the path ahead appeared even darker than my current surroundings, I opted to make my way up to the road above. This ravine seemed neither as steep nor as tall as the one back by Dan's car, so it wasn't long before I was able to see clearly again. And when I saw what was left of James spread across the tarmac, some 20 feet back from where I sprouted from between the trees, though, I almost screamed. Even from a distance, I could see that he was damn near split in two from the crotch up, inspiring me to fall back to my knees, gasping for breath. My senses were in chaos when I got back to my feet, charging down that road with everything I had left in me. I wasn't entirely sure of how long it would take to get back to my hometown on foot, but all I cared about was distancing myself from the carnage, feeling like the world's biggest idiot for not accompanying my sister back home. With my head in constant chaos, I had completely lost track of how long I had been running for when I heard the rumbling coming from somewhere from the direction I was sprinting toward. At that moment, with my mind all over the place and still almost crippled with fear, I just leapt into the bushes alongside the road. And when the headlights of the approaching vehicle lit up the road, however, I just chuckled at my idiocy in confusing the echoing engine with the sounds of gobbling madness. I didn't think it through. Hell, I wasn't thinking straight in the slightest. But after I threw myself back out into the road, desperate to catch the attention of the oncoming driver, to find the vehicle much closer than I expected, it was already too late to react. I let out one final laugh at my own stupid ass before I don't know how long I was out for between the booze I knocked back after we got back into my car, back at that fucking tree. Everything that happened was a bit of a blur, even when we got knocked off the road. Benny was still completely out of it when I came to, but luckily my other bottle of emergency whiskey in the center console wasn't broken. I nudged my buddy a few times, but he just kind of moaned a bit. Poor guy had a long day with me inadvertently resurrecting the fucker that almost killed my ass last year. So I figured I'd let him sleep it off for a while. It is the least I could do, all things considered. I went ahead and crawled up the hill, hoping I could find a phone and call a taxi or a tow truck or something. It was kind of funny that I was well aware that I had broken that freaky fucker loose, but I totally forgot everything else that happened since then. So when I saw all the bodies and shit, I kind of started puking again. When I was done with that, I just sort of whipped my head from side to side, trying to figure out what to do next. It was around that time that I saw that funky looking bird guy holding James upside down and slamming its beak into his bits and pieces until he almost split the poor bastard in two. Of course, I dry heaved some more, trying to settle down and shit, which was probably a bad idea as it caught the attention of that feathered fuck. It just glared back at me, still holding both ankles of my buddy. Okay, so he wasn't my buddy. I kind of thought he was an asshole, but that monster was just glaring at me, dropping what was left James to the ground. It was kind of awkward, to be honest. Luckily, even with puking out half of the booze I drunk, I was still drunk enough to not be too scared. But even with that, okay, so this is gonna sound weird, but I knew it wasn't gonna kill me. So I just gave it a wave, cause I figured it already seen that I saw it, so I don't want to be rude or anything. Next thing I know, it comes strolling back this way, jumping over the pile of wrecked cars and glaring right at me. When it got right up on me, it cocked its head to the side, looking over the ledge we'd rolled down. I was hoping like hell that Benny was still knocked out, cause I figured it'd flip its shit if it saw him again. But when it turned back to face me, I just shrugged. It made a kind of warbling yip or something, like gave me an awkward nod, and started walking back to town before bounding across the road. I turned around to watch it and make sure it fucked off and all, finally really taking in all of the destruction around me. It looked like every house was busted open, with windows smashed and smoke billowing from the windows. There were bodies everywhere, making me worried that the whole town had been rampaged. Of course, when I started hearing more screams, glass shattering and guns firing, I remembered this town is bigger than just the square I was standing in. It was about that time when I thought I should check on Benny and hope we could just head back home. Yeah, I felt like a dick for bringing that thing loose and all, but I still had no fucking idea how that happened in the first place. Like 1 minute I was just laying in my bed trying to sleep through Thanksgiving, and the next my friend was tackling me to the ground right behind that big ass tree. How the hell can I be blamed for something that I don't even remember? I mean, it could have been some sublimate, like an implanted idea in the back of my brain, I guess. But it's not my fault, right? Anyway, so I climbed back down. I kind of skidded back down that hill on my ass, shaking Benny all crazy like when I peeled open the buckled door. He was all groggy and shit, but snapped back to the world when he saw the blood on my face. I filled him in on what I seen back up in the town square, even the part about the turkey man guy thing just walking by me like we were cool and all. He got that thoughtful look on his face like he does when he's being all serious, like he was trying to solve a riddle or something. So I suggested that we just head back home and start warning folks back there, since this place was already pretty much fucked. But he wouldn't hear it. Damn stubborn ass. And then he started staring me down, asking if I remembered anything about that tree. I just shrugged again, cause I couldn't remember shit. But when we both climbed up that hill, and he saw the massive carnage, he started dry heaving too, which made me start puking again. I guess that emptying out more booze cleared things up a bit, or knocked something loose, cause I did start to remember something. It wasn't about how I ended up back at that tree, but from way back when I woke up in that hospital. I still couldn't remember much, just fragments here and there. But it was that nurse who told me about the tree. Like, I swear she talked about it like every single night, like a damn bedtime story. I do kind of wish I kept that part to myself, though, since I think I just about convinced Benny to head back home. But this just gave him a new fucking quest. He was convinced that she might have been the one who put this shit in my head, and that she had to know how to close whatever door I'd opened. I mean, yeah, he had a good point and all, but could we even make it to the hospital with all the screams that were still coming from off in the distance? Before I can make that argument, Benny was running into some convenience store across from the police station. So I just sat down on the curb. I gotta say though, I don't know if it was some kind of serendip, some good fortune for me, but only a few feet from where I decided to park my ass, I noticed an open cooler. You gotta love these small town parties. With Dan's recollection that it was the nurse who told him about the tree, I had to believe that she may know something about how to send the Gobbleman back again. Yeah, it wasn't much to go on, and if she wanted to set that freak loose on the world once more, I was certain she wouldn't exactly be forthcoming about how to go about this, but I had no other idea how to proceed. I wanted nothing more than to haul ass back to Brook, load everything we could into the car, and gun it out of town without looking back. But I knew we had to stop this. Once again, it was up to me to find a way to end this madness. Like Tony had told me before he made his final stand against this abomination, we couldn't believe that it would stop, that it could very well spread a sadistic reign of terror across the entire country if we didn't put an end to it. The only thing I could think to do was to see if I could find a map of the town with which I was quite unfamiliar. With the ambient noises of death and destruction once more providing a backdrop to every movement I made, I hoped to find a safer passage to reach the hospital. Yes, I had no reason to believe that Nurse Amalia would even be there at this hour, especially being Thanksgiving and all, but it was the only option I could think of. Worst case, maybe there was someone who could tell me where she lived, if she wasn't amongst the likely skeleton crew at work on a holiday. After noticing the small shop with the windows smashed in, I climbed in, quickly locating exactly what I sought on a rack near the counter. With that, I made a quick scan of the area, finding what looked to be something of a beaten path cutting through the woods, which should hopefully provide safe passage to our next destination. Running back outside to find Dan knocking back a beer next to an already crushed can and 4 more left in the six-pack he had somehow located over the matter of minutes I spent in the shop. And choosing not to inquire as to where he may have tracked this down, only rolling my eyes at the guy who now swayed from one side to the other as he sat on the ground with his legs spread out before him. I just attempted to track down a functional vehicle in the vicinity. The red 4x4 I selected, right next to some poor, eviscerated man, splayed out on the concrete, still had the engine running. And the windshield was shattered with a crimson streak of gore from where the poor bastard had been dragged from the helm, but the engine seemed functional enough to fit our needs. After helping Dan into the truck, his now even more hammered legs providing little assistance, I started guiding the borrowed truck to where the road chute split just a ways past the town square. I could still hear the screams and commotion of innocent blood soiling the earth from not quite as far off as I'd hoped, but I had to keep going. Bear Island is maybe half the size of Calcon Peak, which was both a good and a bad thing considering our circumstances. On the good side, the hospital was only a few miles away. The bad side, though, with far fewer victims to quench the thirst of that beaked abomination, it wouldn't take long to circle back to both us and the city across the bridge. 2, even the backroads wouldn't distance us enough from the ongoing reign of terror. If nothing else, once we managed to veer around the crashed vehicles and destruction already left in the wake of this madness, the trail through the woods, though bumpy and hard to remain as quiet as I had hoped, was somewhat smooth, if rocky sailing. At first, anyway. Between the dried leaves crunching beneath the tires, the branches scraping against the sides of the truck, and the lumpy terrain, I was having trouble keeping track of the ambient sounds of chaos back in town. By the time the far more aggravated noises of snapping twigs and crunching bark met my ears, I feared it was already too late. Right after I took a sharp left turn, the silhouette of the hospital coming into view beneath the vibrant glow of the skull moon, I didn't have a chance to slam on the brakes when the ruined body of a middle-aged man slammed to the ground only feet from the front bumper. I physically winced from the sound of the bones snapping beneath the tires and the jarring sensation of the truck bouncing over the body I actually hoped was already dead, finally snapping Dan's passed-out ass back to the waking world. I cursed aloud while battling to keep from retching across the dashboard when another shadowed form plundered through the trees before us. Instinctively, I hit the brakes, my mind still reeling from pummeling the poor bastard I couldn't prevent hitting, my subconscious desperate not to nail someone else. At that moment, as I grew far more aware of my bodily spasms and tremors, I found myself face to, beak of that monster again. It just stood there, glaring back at me, the hatred lining its dark and sinister gaze with that flicker of remembrance of the last time we met. The fear threatened to paralyze me, the realization that my plan to dodge that freak had been in vain, almost crippling my every sense. That, along with the knowledge, I would be far less likely to survive this encounter. As we glared upon one another, its beak caked with the bodily fluids of God knows how many townsfolk, and my mind battling to regain control of my body, it let out a shrieking howl unlike anything my ears knew how to accept. It was at that point, as it began to take wide strides toward us, and Dan screaming drunken gibberish from my right, when I felt that conviction blossom within me once more. I slammed the pedal to the floor so hard, I thought I may well push it through the bottom. The tires shrieked against the dirt road, grasping hold of it as the Gobbleman lunged right at us. With it being in middle leap as we sped toward it, the front end of the truck nailed its shins, causing its face to slam onto the hood. It fumbled its taloned fingers in an attempt to grab on, but being caught off guard by the hit, and its legs having snapped in opposing directions, all it could do was claw at the red paint job before sliding off the side and tumbling to the ground. I hit the gas even harder, gunning it toward the shadowed hospital, refusing to look back. The truck violently rocked from side to side, the wheels bouncing in and out of dips and ditches, randomly spinning against dried leaves and dirt, but I wouldn't stop. I heard that haunting, familiar sound of trees buckling and branches snapping as the beast leapt from one to the other, making its pursuit to stop us in our tracks, but we had a bit of a lead on it at least. As the wheels jarred the truck so hard I thought it may well flip us backward and onto the roof. I almost puked from the relief of landing back to smooth pavement. I watched the trees begin to retreat through the rear view, our grotesque stalker landing back on its feet before sprinting after us. This only inspired me to push the engine even harder, the tires leaving a cloud of dust and debris in our wake. I saw the shadowed form at our backs shrink all the more as we sped across the straight shot, right at the hospital. Once more, the wheels bounced as they hit the curb of the mostly vacant parking lot, with the wide glass windows of the lobby nearing in a hurry. I hit the brakes the second we nailed the next curb, that of the walkway and entrance to the lobby. I felt them skid, sending us sliding sideways into the glass, shattering the windows with the awning cascading down next to my door. With that, Dan threw open his door, and we both practically launched ourselves out as the roof of the old truck caved halfway into the driver's seat. As we sped toward the stairs on foot, the dull safety lights assuring me that the place was running on emergency power, and the elevators would likely be useless, I heard another hauntingly shrill squeal from somewhere outside as we passed through the door. We couldn't know if the nurse we sought was here, but we hauled ass in search of the third floor, on which Dan had been housed for those months after his surprising rebirth. The lobby was deserted, showing absolutely no trace of potential inhabitants of this building, but I held on to that semblance of hope. Hope that we would not only track our quarry, but get the answers we needed before that monster would find us. As we burst through the door to the third floor, Dan almost fell to the floor, his still barely coordinated limbs faltering. I just snatched his arm, preventing him from face-planting while we ran in search of the nurse's station. Rounding a corner, we almost slammed right into a young, pretty, red-haired nurse who appeared as shocked to see us as we were to see her. Gasping for air, I begged her for any information on Amalia. Her harried and questioning reply immediately left my mind reeling again, the wind feeling completely knocked out of me.
Amalia Van Jansen?
Van Jansen? I replied, Dan looking back at me, shaking his head to illustrate that he too had no idea. After a short back and forth, my chaos-filled brain fighting to keep up, the nurse led us down a corridor. Within moments, she guided us to a room which appeared to be some sort of break room or lounge for the staff, with only one resident resting within. As a loud, slamming sound echoed from somewhere beneath us, the pretty nurse jumped, holding a hand to her chest, while the elderly woman staring through the window didn't so much as twitch.
"You should go on, dear,"
she said, smiling at the one who led us here. As the redhead turned to leave, Van Jansen gave her one final instruction before turning her attention to us.
"Perhaps find a suitable place to hide. He will be here soon."
The nurse made a puzzled expression, but continued to shuffle away quickly. More chaos rang out from the lower levels, accented by the occasional blood-curdling scream, but this still didn't rattle the calm demeanor of the elderly woman, who just smiled back at us.
"I'm so proud of you,"
she said, looking up at Dan with glassy eyes. "Tell us everything," I demanded, not wasting time asking kindly. Tell us what you know, and how to stop this.
Oh, you can't stop it, dear. But I would be happy to tell you whatever you wish to know. If nothing else, perhaps it will set your mind at ease before you die.
Yeah, I can't lie. I wanted to smack that smug grin off her face, to beat her into submission and demand that she tell us how to put an end to this. But I had a feeling that would be both a waste of time and a fool's errand. The only hope I had was that she would let something slip, her arrogance and confidence spilling more information than she wished to share. As she patted her hand on the plush cushion of the seat next to her, Dan just gave me a shrug and a defeated expression. It was at that point, as Dan took the chair beside her, and me the one across from her, when I saw that my friend had made certain to grab the remaining beers he brought along for the ride. He sat them on the table, sliding one to me, and popping open the one he still held. I can't deny, that first sip did hit the spot. Yeah, my body was still twitching and trembling. I had a feeling that a bit of a buzz would make the story the crazy old bat was about to share far more tolerable, especially with the 11th hour upon us. Not unlike the tale the brat's grandfather had shared with my Uncle Tony the last time I faced my bitter and bloody demise, this chapter in the Van Jansen history book left my jaw unhinged and my mind in chaos. But by the time her story came to a close, I was certain that I would not be around to see this one through. This was the final piece of the legend of the Gobbleman, of the secondary gateway between this world and its prison. This was the story of how the Van Jansen line did not end with the widow or her newborn abomination. After settling down in and exploring the surrounding areas beyond Calcon, the settlers sent word to those they left behind. While it took some time to arrange, it would eventually be decided to send more adventurous denizens across the ocean in search of a new home. Those who would begin to populate the island neighboring the settlement. Amongst those new residents to be was one Johanna Van Jansen, the younger sister of the one who would inadvertently bring the downfall of those initial settlers sometime before the Second Fleet would reach the shore of the new land. Upon discovering the decomposing bodies soon after arriving on the coast, the settlers suspected the remaining natives of this foul and nefarious deed. Though little is known about the deliberations between the initially opposing forces, it would seem that they eventually came to an understanding. Miss Van Jansen was understandably haunted by her sister's gory demise, but reluctantly believed the story she was told about how her would-be nephew and how he was responsible for the death and destruction. While she mourned her sibling, she did not retreat or hide from her people, nor those she now considered friends. The Van Jansens were of an ancient bloodline, according to legend, one which was born into such dark knowledge and crafts of which would not so casually be spoken. Though she would never share this with another living soul outside of her kin, she had little doubt about her sister's true intentions, that it was she who willingly forged a pact with the father of her child. Whether this was the fact of the matter, or bloated tales of her ancestors, Amalia claimed that, after communing with the dead, Johanna discovered the bitter truth, that Nora had in fact attempted to summon forth the spirit of her love who had been lost to the sea on the initial voyage to the new land. Having been a practitioner of the dark arts in life himself, this was a pact the couple had forged long before his untimely demise, that should one of them fall before bringing a child into the world, the other would bring them forth from the afterlife. Whether or not it was indeed her husband or some demonic entity, as the natives had theorized, who took possession of the wayward turkey, spilling its seed within the lonesome widow, there's no way to know, of course. But her sister would not let this go. She vowed to honor Nora's wishes, and find a way to allow the creature to be reborn, even if it may be ages after she left this world herself. While the other settlers were both rebuilding Calcon and founding Bear Island, named after Hendrik von Bear, the honorable captain of the boat that guided them here, she was following her own course behind the scenes. Having learned what she could about the magic which sealed her nephew away, she understood that it was not actually trapped within that cave or behind that wall, but imprisoned between worlds. All she needed was a way to create another exit, a back door of sorts. After convincing the natives she had befriended to give her something of a tour of the locations in which her sister had lived, she came across a most curious thing with which she was certain she could enact her plan. A long, spiny, and blackened feather. She could not retrieve this item until no eyes were upon or alongside her, but she committed its location to memory. Later that night, though still unfamiliar with the terrain, she snuck away, stalking through the woods to seek out her treasure. It wouldn't be until the bridge was erected, paving a more convenient passage to the island upon which she would take up residence when she went to work. Feeling that it would be disrespectful to the memory of her nephew to prepare his future entrance into this world upon the soil in which his mother fell, she hoped that he would find greater fortune on this side of the river. Whatever ingredients she combined with the feather to set the seed of the tree, which would grow to gargantuan proportions, Amalia could not or would not say, but the words with which she blessed it, having carved them into stone, would imbue the soil and the essence of the tree itself with them, long after they faded from the rock. Johanna van Jansen had been gone for many centuries by the time her plan would truly come to fruition. For the first time, anyway. Amalia was only a child when it happened, when her mother, a woman wholly devoted to her family name and traditions, convinced a wide-eyed and somewhat gullible teen to awaken the old tree, similarly to how the elderly nurse had implanted it in Dan's brain as he slept for weeks on end. The woman, though certain that her demonic ancestor would never turn its beak against her, made sure to nestle her and her daughter out of sight by the time the teenage boy made his way to the outskirts of town. But their ears still bore witness to the screams of horror and chaos she let loose on the town, the residents reducing the buildings to ash in their efforts to defeat the creature. Though she was uncertain as to how Dan found himself freed from the cavern before the beast was imprisoned once more, she had some theories. Given that he had appeared somewhere between the second doorway to its dimensional prison and the original gateway upon the mountainside, she thought that he may himself have been caught between worlds for a moment. Being not the intended captive of this particular tomb, perhaps he had been quite literally ejected from it, into the water, which could bear its own mystical properties. Though there had never been mention of the native boy who gave his life to lock away the abomination the first time around, it's very possible that his remains may lie at the bottom of that lake as well. Whatever the case, with Dan being the one whose blood sealed that cavern shut once more, Amalia thought it quite fitting that he be the one to spring it loose again. With his weakened state and the knowledge through her life and generational history, she had no doubt that she could set the seed deep enough to resonate over the time they spent in each other's company. At this point, the nurse fell silent again, gazing back out of the window with a subtle smirk on her face. I was barely aware that the commotion was nearing as I studied her face, pondering her story for any evidence of how we could put this to an end. "Please," I begged, laying a trembling hand on her shoulder. "Please tell me how to stop this." She glanced back at me, her smile spreading wider, her gaze faltering slightly. I didn't fully notice it at first.
"Only the boy, whose blood pierced the tree, could provide the answers you seek,"
she said, turning back to the haunting glow of the skull moon. I looked at Dan, who was halfway passed out, just offering me a shrug, and back to the woman, acting like she didn't have a care in the world. "Please," I began to repeat, as the closed door to my back practically blew apart. My racing heart leaping into my chest, I pushed back to my trembling legs, staring into those hateful eyes of the one who would likely be finishing the job he started last year, any second now. As it began to pace closer, I was frantically looking for anything I could use as a weapon, even if I knew it would be of no use. I don't even know how many bullets my uncle drilled into it before it peeled his arms away like the wings of a fly. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. Tony fought until he had nothing left, and I would be damned if I would tarnish his memory by letting his sacrifice be in vain. It was at that point, as the monstrosity drew closer, while I snatched up the chair beside me by its back, when the elderly woman just casually sauntered around me with her arms outstretched before her. I hadn't even noticed Dan standing beside me, let alone her getting to her feet, with my mind being in chaos at the time, but I couldn't understand what she was thinking. As she paced toward the Gobbleman, its previously hunched and feral posture relaxing, its head cocking to one side, I just nudged Dan, tilting my head in the direction of the door on the opposite side of the room, which I hoped would lead to an exit. While we began to back away from what I knew was about to happen, I could only hope that she could keep the creature's focus long enough for us to escape. Though I was attempting to keep track of her progress toward the door, I couldn't even pry my eyes away from the scene before me. Amalia, stroking her fingers across the gore and blood-lined beak, those taloned hands now raising to wrap around her back. I could hear the woman's gentle sobs as the two embraced one another, completely caught off guard by that elongated beak resting on her shoulder. What happened next was so swift, so relentless, and so jarring that I almost collapsed to the floor, my legs turning to wet noodles beneath me. The monster just pulled back, clutching its hands around her shoulders, digging its claws into the flesh, as Amalia screamed out in both horror and shock. The two just glared at each other for a moment, before that beak spread wide, swinging down and snapping her skull in between its jaws, bursting her head apart like a watermelon tossed from the 10th floor to the concrete below. It yanked back, peeling away what was left of her head, pecking down over and over into the stump of her neck and through her chest, until it reared back with its hands, tearing her in two. By the time the meaty halves were dropped to the floor with a duet of splats, I was already yanking at the door, screaming with the hopelessness of the lock not giving way. I began to hyperventilate as those darkened eyes cut back to meet mine, while Dan cursed in drunken gibberish beside me. It almost felt in slow motion as it lunged from the floor, cracking the tiles from the violence with which it took off. I tried to move, but my legs would not listen, feeling bonded to the ground beneath them. I just resigned myself to what was to come, seeing no other options at this point. While my eyes zeroed in on the pointed tip of that beak soaring right at me, two things happened at once. As Dan collided with me, seemingly attempting to push me out of the way, I felt an agonizing, burning sensation in my right shoulder. When he screamed out, our howls blending into one, I heard another sound echoing from the background. Gunshots. When another shriek joined our chorus, that of the Gobbleman itself, toppling beside where Dan and I hit the floor. I thought it was from the bullets tearing into its feathered flesh from behind, but as it rolled onto its side, clutching at its shoulder, I heard a voice I was certain I'd never hear again.
"Get up!"
Brooke yelled out, as she and Alice ran up, helping Dan and me from the floor. The creature was still writhing on its side as we staggered toward the door, Alice still wailing out as she continued emptying the magazine of the assault rifle she held into the quivering beast. Brooke smacked her across the back of the head, causing her to spin in place, looking enraged before understanding what her friend was trying to accomplish. Within seconds, we were gunning it back down the steps, my girlfriend helping me along, while Alice assisted Dan. I still had no idea what had happened, only that the girls had somehow found us, and that I had a beak-sized hole in my shoulder. but I just assumed that Dan needed help due to his intoxicated legs not functioning properly. It wasn't until we reached my car, which Brooke had apparently driven this way to find us, when I saw the far more sizable wound on the left shoulder of my drunken friend. While I was still putting the puzzle pieces together, understanding that the monster had impaled through Dan's shoulder and into mine as he attempted to push me out of the way, the glass shattering from above pulled my attention back to our dire circumstances. With Brooke and Alice on the driver's side of my car, and me and Dan on the passenger side, we each snatched open a door. Unfortunately, with the car parked sideways and the driver's side angled to the front of the demolished entrance to the hospital, Alice, attempting to climb into the back seat, didn't have a chance to react. Almost as an enormous arrow flying toward the ground, the creature shot down right at her. As I hesitated at the passenger seat, reaching out and screaming for her to move, her quivering eyes met mine briefly, before her skull exploded from the impact, the velocity of the beast not slowing it down until her entire body followed the course of her ruined face. If nothing else, the impact with the ground after it blew through the obliterated blonde gave us a bit of time to escape the paralyzing shock of witnessing our exploding friend. From what I could tell, through the massive carnage, as I rounded the car to ensure that Brooke was alright, it looked as though the creature was something of a bloody, feathered pretzel crushed to the concrete. When it began to twitch, with the tune of his bones audibly snapping back into place, however, I knew that we had no time to waste. We could mourn Alice and all of our other fallen friends if we survived this, but not yet. Dan was muttering his denial in far more legible words as we sped from that damned hospital, but when my senses returned enough, I turned my attention back to my beloved. "How?" was all I could command my lips to utter, hoping that she would know what I was getting at.
I was trembling so badly, crying my eyes red and feeling the hopelessness crippling me by the time Alice suggested I pull over. Though we had both left our boyfriends to a likely agonizing demise, she was almost frustratingly calm and composed, something that only added annoyance to my already fracturing emotions. We were still on the outskirts of Calkin Peak, with the world unsettlingly silent beyond the rumbling of the engine. With my erratic breathing hastening more by the second, I threw my door open, desperate to inhale fresh oxygen. Leaning up against the car, attempting to compose myself to the best of my ability, Alice just strolled up beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. We stood there for a time, gazing out into the world, not speaking a word. But when I turned to face my friend, a conviction building within me, my mind was already made up. "We have to go back," I said with an almost defeated shrug. With a slight smirk and a subtle nod, Alice let out a heavy sigh. "I'll drive," she said, with a winded chuckle. Given my still violently trembling limbs and her far more composed state, I couldn't disagree with her recommendation. Within minutes, we were speeding back toward Bear Island. I was scared. I won't even try to deny that, but I knew that this was the right call, or I hoped it was anyway. Alice still looked so relaxed and calm, but also focused and unyielding. Honestly, I was quite impressed. I had never seen this side of her. Though we had been friends for a long time, I had always found her somewhat shallow and self-centered. But maybe I had been judging her too harshly all these years. It was the strangest thing, something I hadn't noticed, being at the steering wheel when we sped back toward our home. But the second we crossed over that bridge, the full moon above transformed to the haunting skull I still see in my nightmares. Alice just glared over at me, the confidence in her stoic expression faltering. After turning her focus back to the road ahead, I could tell that her previously calm demeanor had shifted, that the fear was beginning to take hold of her senses. A few more miles up that dark road, with the ominous glow of the skull moon still guiding the path ahead, She once more turned her face to me, opening her mouth to speak words she would never get to say. She had only glanced at me for seconds, taken her eyes off the road for maybe a few blinks of the eye. But even if she had had them glued to the path before us the whole time, I honestly don't think she could have avoided what happened next. We both screamed out when the silhouetted form appeared on the road right in front of us. Alice tried to hit the brakes, but it was already too late. The moment we made contact, it almost felt like time slowed. I swear I saw, in full vivid color, those knees snapping backward when the front bumper made contact. With a crimson splash, the windshield buckled from the impact as the horror-stricken face planted into it. I felt the tires skid sideways as the broken husk tumbled across the roof, planting to the concrete behind us when we came to a halt. With the driver's side of the car facing the twitching body, oozing fluids across the tarmac, Alice just gazed through, with her hands cupped around her mouth. I ran out, straight toward the poor victim of this unexpected collision, falling to my knees beside him upon recognizing what was left of his face. When the lone, semi-functional eye of Dwayne peered up into mine, Alice came staggering up beside us, howling a hopeless wail as her brother coughed and spluttered. Both of his legs were splayed outward at the knees, with his left collarbone poking through the flesh, planted to the ground. The left side of his face looked like a fresh ground beef patty, with shards of skull gouging through. Even with his jaw disconnected on that side, he was still attempting to speak in between gurgled hacks.
Benny... Ravine...
Don't try to speak, I said, both from concern and the churning of my stomach, caused by the gargled words and the fluids spitting from his gaping mouth. Alice was just weeping and shivering all over, her previously composed state completely shattered.
Cars... bottlenecked... We crashed down the ravine. Go away. Gobbleman killed.
As those final perplexing as shit words left his mouth, he gazed transfixed on his sister. Before going completely vacant, his twitching subsided. His body fell still. Alice howled, and I let her. She was still a wreck when we finally got back into the car, with me resuming my position at the driver's seat. As we headed back in pursuit of a more uncertain fate, the sight of James's twisted and strewn apart body splayed across the concrete just before the bottlenecked pile of vehicles came into view. Once more, Alice shrieked, this time in a near-deafening pitch, as I squealed the tires to halt. I slowly worked around the split-apart body, doing everything I could to keep in view enough to avoid it, without making direct eye contact. The clutter of many shapes and sizes of vehicles looked impossible to breach at first, but after taking note of the small hatchback on its roof at the far left of the pileup, I felt certain that my boyfriend's car had enough power to nudge it aside. It took a bit of back and forth to convince the wreckage to make way for us to get around, but as I eased across the small space I made, the right tires wrestling against the rougher ground near the tree line, I quickly demanded that Alice close her eyes, before they may meet the carnage spread across the town square. We stopped in place for a time, while my mind was still trying to decipher Dwayne's closing words. Glancing around the scattering of discarded limbs and gore, desperate to find any evidence of where Benny and Dan may be, I finally noticed the bucked railing in front of what looked to be a steep drop-off next to where the cars had piled up. As I crept over to the edge, gasping upon glancing down to see Dan's car crumpled at the base of the ravine, I felt the semblance of hope I had remaining, leaking from my eyes. Just as I was considering climbing down to see if anyone had survived this, the skull moon reflected its glow upon the open doors. Noticing the subtle tracks leading away from the wreckage and up the overgrown foliage, up from that deep ditch, I had to believe that at least one of those we left behind had survived. I could only hope that Benny was still out there somewhere. Bear Island is not a large place, though I expected to be able to still make out a soundtrack of chaos as the Gobbleman plundered through this small town. I heard no evidence of that, to my surprise. What I could hear, as I closed my eyes to lend all of my focus to the only sense that could help me, was the ambient rumbling of an engine and rustling of branches somewhere deeper into the heart of the island. I don't know how, but I knew that was Benny. I knew that he was on a mission, and I knew he was going to need my help to see it through. Before I headed back to the car, I ran into the police station in search of any and every weapon I could find. It took some time to track down the weapons storage. I had to bust open a few locked doors with a billy club I found in the office, but when I tracked down the veritable treasure trove of guns and ammunition, I could only hope that they would provide enough firepower to slow down the monster. Heading back to the car with a bagload of assault rifles, shotguns, pistols, and ammo, I just tossed them onto the back seat. I didn't know where we were headed when I got back behind the wheel. All I could do was head in the direction from where those sounds were echoing. Everything had fallen silent again by the time we made our way deeper into Bear Island, but as I drifted around more bodies, scattered across the road, paralleling the woods after noticing the shadowed shape of the hospital in the horizon, I felt more certain of our course. As I passed by the last few houses on the outskirts of town, with only a short road between us and the hospital, I heard an echoing sound that convinced me the entire building was collapsing before we could reach it. Pulling into the parking lot, my heart practically bursting through my chest from its hastened and violent pulsing, I let out a shuddered sigh upon seeing the truck impaled into the lobby with the front awning crumpled upon it. With the windows shattered on either side of the broken down entryway, it wasn't as tricky as I feared to make our way into the building. Alice, now wearing an expression of rage-fueled determination, held her assault rifle close to her body as we passed into the stairwell. I also held a rifle in hand and a pistol tucked into my belt, all Magnum PI style, as we stealthily followed the ambient sounds of destruction into the guts of the old hospital. Benny and I had spent enough time in this place while Dan was recovering that I felt confident in his destination. Though I wasn't entirely certain of his motivations, it wasn't hard to figure out that he may have sought out Dan's nurse. Being an elder of this island, perhaps she was more familiar with the town's legends and why that tree was capable of unleashing the dormant monster. She was the only person with whom we were familiar in this town, so it made sense, given that he traveled this way. As we plundered down that hallway on the third floor, the sounds of carnage guiding the path ahead, I could only hope that we would make it in time. Bursting through the door, just in time to see the creature leaping at Benny and Dan, Alice and I started firing off rounds the second we entered. Both of the boys screamed when that beacon peeled through Dan's shoulder and into Benny, my heart shrieking with the fear that we were too late. As we plowed bullets into every inch of that feathered flesh, the beast tumbled to the floor, gripping onto its own shoulder, seemingly ignoring the wounds we were inflicting. While it was distracted, I ran forward, helping the guys from the floor, while Alice squealed a hate-filled howl, firing every round she had left into the whimpering abomination. I had to physically shake her to break her focus. Tossing her rifle to the floor, she gave me a determined nod, and we headed back to the stairs and out into the night, illuminated beneath those hollowed-out eyes of the skull moon. I didn't even see it coming when the glass shattered above us, just averted my gaze to Alice as she split apart beside me, raining blood and gore across me. Once more, I was nearly paralyzed from the grotesque sight, but Benny snapped me out of it. The guys were hurt, and we were all shaken, but we hadn't the time to waste on dwelling on the things we had witnessed. We had to put an end to this, and by the pensive look on his face, ignoring his oozing shoulder, I knew that my boyfriend was on the brink of working it out. I didn't ask what he was on to. I didn't want to break his focus. Dan was writhing in the back seat, clutching at his ruined shoulder, but if nothing else, he appeared somewhat sober for once. As we reached the town square again, my beloved passenger yelped out a winded,
"That's it."
Even with the haunting sounds of that monster leaping from house to house from somewhere behind us, apparently having recovered from its impact from the concrete, I was beginning to feel confident.
"We have to get back to the tree,"
Benny said, with that expression of conviction only cementing the hope within me. We still had a good lead on the Gobbleman as I veered the tires back around the bottlenecked wreckage to the road leading back toward our quarry. I didn't know what Benny knew, but I would do my part to set whatever plan he had in motion. I would get us to that goddamn tree.
I don't know why I didn't see it before. The link between the beast and my friend. Even when Dan told me about how it just strolled right past him back in town, I just couldn't make that connection. But with what the batshit crazy nurse told me, it all made sense. I don't know if she meant to slip the part about the boy her mother had tricked into unleashing the beast 5 decades back, but could that really be all it would take? She said that his blood was pierced into the tree, but Dan awakened it by spilling his blood upon the stone slab. Yeah, it's not much to go on. Maybe it didn't matter where the blood was spilled to let it loose, but the only thing Dan pierced was his own flesh. Maybe all we needed to do to put this thing back in its cage was to gouge something with the blood of the one who let it loose back into the tree itself. The downside of this, of course, was that I didn't have anything sharp enough to accomplish that, a fact which occurred to me right as we passed by what was left of James, still splayed out on the road. Brooke almost jumped out of her skin when I yelled for her to slam on the brakes, the apologetic shrug I offered barely settling that pissed-off glare she gave me. But she stopped nonetheless. I knew James had a pocket knife, even if I didn't exactly look forward to looting his ruined corpse for it. But when I saw it gripped in his hand, layered in thick, black blood, I was almost distracted from the grotesque sight. Almost. After having to stomp his hand until the rigor mortis subsided enough for me to claim my prize, my throat battling the stomach acid attacking it from beneath, I could only hope I hadn't squandered too much time. With the sound of cars being crushed from somewhere behind us, my mind flashing back to being chased through the streets of downtown Calkin Peak, this time last year shooting forward from the back of my mind, Brooke hit the gas as soon as I jumped back into the passenger seat. I could see the trees buckling under the light of the skull moon, maybe a half-mile back down the road, when we skidded to a halt alongside that imposing tree. I heard branches cascading to the ground, sounding as though they were only feet away. It was now or never. Brooke slipped a fresh magazine into her assault rifle as I helped Dan from the back seat, snatching a pistol from the bag next to him. My girlfriend stood on guard next to the car while my friend and I approached the widened trunk. His shoulder was still leaking, his complexion pale from blood loss. I was feeling lightheaded and loopy too, my skin feeling colder by the second, my racing pulse only hastening the blood gushing from my open wound. After wiping the borrowed blade on my pants, smearing as much of that foul-smelling ick from the stainless steel as I could, I held it beneath the shredded tissue of Dan's shoulder. As I held the tip of the blade to the thick bark, with Dan holding himself upright by leaning against the massive structure, the discharging rifle assured me that the time had come. I glanced up to see the Gobbleman itself, landing down only feet before the hood of my car, barely reacting to the rounds burying into his flesh. I yelled for my girlfriend to run, or duck, or just get the fuck out of here, but she didn't react, solely focused on her assault. But the beast paid her no mind. Those blackened eyes were fixed to mine, and mine alone, while its beak flapped open and shut, now likely cursing at me and gobbling gibberish. "You're too late, you son of a bitch," I said with far more arrogance than I had a right to. I allowed a smirk to reach across my lips as I pressed my other hand against the one propped against the tree. "Go back to hell," I shouted, plunging the blade soaked in my friend's blood as deeply into the bark as I could reach. At that moment, as I could taste victory on the tip of my tongue, the Gobbleman's words falling short, just like the last time we faced off against one another. It just uttered a trembling warble, its crimson-coated beak upturning on each side, still glaring me down. I heard the clicking of Brooke's gun, having spent its load, the whispering whimper leaving my own mouth, as that abomination casually strolled closer with its arms outstretched to its sides. "Brooke," I said, my voice trembling and my head growing lighter. "Run." Before I had a chance to register if she heard or reacted to my words, the Gobbleman charged right at me, howling a victorious sound of madness, while a trembling hand gripped onto my shoulder from behind. "No, you run," an agonizingly familiar phrase spoke from my back. I felt my body soaring sideways as Dan pushed me aside, just in time for that beak to plow right through his chest and into the dense bark of that blackened and haunting tree. With a muffled scream, the beast battled to push itself back from the trunk as an alarmingly bright light split the bark in two. With a gory, moist, and squelching sound, I saw the head of that creature burying itself deeper and deeper into my friend, the light growing more vibrant and piercing by the second. I watched on in horror as the elongated neck and slender frame followed the course of the head, contorting and spasming as it crushed slimmer and slimmer while being pulled into the tree through the doorway of my friend's chest cavity. As the feat finalized the relocation of the wretched monster, Dan fell limp to the forest floor as the beast was fully consumed by the rough trunk. The bark sealed itself back shut, the light gradually lessening. I just fell to my back, barely aware of Brooke running across the concrete to my side. As she dropped down beside me, the last sight I saw before my consciousness faded was the pristine orb of the full moon, having once more returned to its natural form.
I was so scared when Benny fell limp that he had lost too much blood before the skull moon retreated. I was so on edge at the time, I almost passed out myself when I heard the voice from behind me. How Dan had survived the feathered freak tearing through his chest was as puzzling to me as it was to him. He just shrugged back at me, rubbing the thin line of scar tissue running down the very center of his torso, rolling the somehow healed shoulder as well. We both looked back to the diminishing line of light on the tree as the gateway between worlds closed once more. By the time that subtle illumination snuffed out completely, there was no residual evidence of Dan's torso having been split down its center, inspiring a winded shrug from both of us. Benny, who was still bleeding on the dried grass, was not quite as fortunate, but he was still alive. Without wasting any more time attempting to put together everything that had gone down, we just loaded my boyfriend into the back seat and sped towards the hospital, back in Calcon Peak. Though he had a good deal of physical therapy to endure, once his shoulder was healed up enough, I am so happy to report that Benny, who has only recently become my husband, is almost back to himself. He is still haunted by the events of two brutal Thanksgivings, as are Dan and I, but he's doing wonderfully under the circumstances. The residents of Bear Island, however, not so much. While there were a good deal of survivors, as Benny became the sole focus of the beast once it realized who he was, only a third of the population survived that night. Being no stranger to such times and events, the residents of our neighboring town are helping them to rebuild. But things will never be the same. There were discussions about cutting down the enormous tree on the outskirts of town, but given the shared lack of knowledge of such mystical things, we couldn't know if this may inadvertently unleash the monster again. For the time being, until we may learn more about the magic which sprung loose the beast, some security measures have been set in place. It was no easy task to build the concrete structure around the circumference of that behemoth, but hopefully it'll be enough. As for us, once renovations have finished up on Bear Island, Benny, Dan, and I are leaving this cursed land. Yes, my husband has become known to the people of this town and its neighbors as something of a savior, the guardian of both Calkin Peak and Bear Island. But we are not about to risk a third encounter with the Gobbleman. Things never end well for the heroes when the trilogy comes to a close. Maybe this is the end for the abomination who brought two towns to their knees over multiple generations. Sure, for all we know, there could be many more potential entrances back to this world from wherever it now dwells. But as far as I'm concerned, that's not our problem anymore. Somehow, I have no doubt that someday the skull moon will shine down on this side of the world again. Perhaps that's simply the nature of this type of trauma, to never truly believe it's over. Whatever the case, whether we have to move to the other side of the world, we won't be there to see it. If everyone else still remaining knows what's good for them, they'll bail too. Maybe that's the only way to ensure that this monster stays buried. To vacate this town. To let it rot. Because if they stay, some Thanksgiving night, the streets of Calkin will be layered in blood once more. And we won't be there to stop it.